the last thing that I'm going to talk about in this webinar is how do I actually describe what my development team needs to build in the actual product. So this is the concept of user stories. So user stories are for what the entrepreneur or the product manager says and describes in terms of what the product needs to do for the development team. Now, if you think about what we had described, the jobs to be done analysis, user story is nothing but taking the jobs to be done analysis and now double clicking on it, breaking it down into the specific things. And user stories describe very simply what users want to do, when they want it, and why they want it. Right? By the way, the user story is really important, not to get into the how-to. It's really about what customers want to do. And in agile development, a user story is the unit of work that a team can do in a sprint. It's like what we call the sprint backlog. By the way, sometimes user stories can be done as simple as, writing it in a card. In other cases, it might actually be a little bit more sophisticated where you lay it out in terms of a canvas. So here's some example of user stories. As a customer, I want to be able to create an account so that I can see the purchases I made in the last year to help me budget for next year. As an executive, I want to generate a report to understand which department need to improve their productivity. As an e-commerce shopper, I want shopping cart functionality to easily purchase items online. So when you are doing your development, you're going to write up a whole series of user stories, and you will organize these user stories in terms of priorities. Now, the user stories, by the way, need to be built with different levels of granularity. So that at the highest level, you might have an epic. An epic is a large body of work. There are larger stories. They're a big user story. And then, so an epic basically is the higher order themes that you want to have. There will be the 2 or 3 or 4 key bets that you're making on your product. And then you break epics into themes. Themes are related user stories that organize works into sub-teams, and that epics can further get organized into more specific user stories. So think of your user stories as a hierarchy, and here's the example of a hierarchy. For example, let's say I'm building a functionality called the wish list, which is very common now in e-commerce applications. So at the highest level, at the epic level, it is essentially, as a customer, I want to be able to have the wish list so that I can come back to buy my product later, right? So this I break down into stories, which is, as a customer, I want to be able to save a product in my wish list. I want to be able to view my wish list. So these are the stories. And within a story, I actually have tasks. And the tasks might be put add to wish list button, create a database to store wish list item, and so on and so forth. So it's important to think about your requirements in terms of a hierarchy. And that hierarchy, you start with the epic and then get down to the stories and then down to tasks. And a few tips for writing requirements are that requirements document should not be too long because nobody's going to read it. It should have a few pages and it should really focus on the key things that you need to build. And when you describe each requirement, don't make it too long. Just describe what's essential and don't get into the nitty-gritty details. Talk about things in smaller chunks. And do not ever talk about the how-to. That's engineering's job. Don't tell them how to build a requirement. Tell them what the requirement needs to do. And understand that a requirement process is going to be an iterative process. So, lastly, the requirements, you might have a long list of requirements, but you need to prioritize them, right? So how do you prioritize your products, your requirements? One thing that you do is you really need to figure out what are the key themes that I'm going to build. So for example, going back to our smart suitcase, one theme might be location and knowing where my suitcase is. The second theme might be preventing my suitcase from being lost. A third theme might be using my suitcase to manage my battery charging and weight requirements, right? So these are the themes. So you start with the theme level, and then you prioritize the themes based on your understanding of, how many customers have this problem, how important is this problem to solve, and how much are they going to pay for it. And then start to build your project work and your sprints based on the prioritized requirements. And by the way, as you from some of you know who are familiar with Agile, this prioritization is a continuous job. At the end of each sprint, we come back and we iterate, and our prioritization is adaptive so that our product backlog is continuously evolving based on what we are learning and what the market is telling us.